Preview. Jazz Image of the 60s in a projection to Friday night, Northrop Auditorium, University of Minnesota, when the Modern Jazz Quartet joins the Minneapolis Symphony in a performance of a concertino. The concertino is a composition by Gunther Schuller for full symphony orchestra and the Modern Jazz Quartet. I'd like to welcome Johnny Smith, who is currently appearing at Herb's and who has explored the world of the orchestra in the symphonic sense, as well as the world of jazz. Johnny Smith, welcome.
Thank you very much, Leigh. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm also very keenly looking forward to hearing this work that you're going to explore tonight.
Well, as a matter of fact, time is somewhat limited, so let's get to the business at hand of auditioning a test pressing of Gunther Schuller and the Modern Jazz Quartet playing a concertino. Incidentally, John, what strictly, in a sense, is a concertino?
Well, Leigh, I believe it would be simply described as being a small concert. Usually they're limited to 3 movements and take a little less time than our heavy works do.
Here is our preview then, John, and then we'll check you for reactions as a jazz man and as a great sensitive arranger and a man who appreciates the symphony orchestra in all of its settings. Now for our preview performance of Friday night's concert at the Minneapolis Northrop Auditorium, University of Minnesota. The Modern Jazz Quartet, Gunther Schuller conducting the orchestra and the quartet through his concertino. You've just heard 3 movements entitled the Concertino, composed by Gunther Schuller, conducted by Gunther Schuller with the Modern Jazz Quartet. Milton Jackson featured on vibraphone, Connie Kay on percussion, and John Lewis featured at the piano with the excellent work of Percy Heath on bass. For reactions to a work like this, let's turn to a man who has spent a great deal of his time in large orchestras, both in the studios at NBC at the other end of the line, some 1,500 miles from here, playing not only as a studio man, music to specification, but informally in jazz clubs and in concert around the country. Johnny Smith, you've just heard this performance. Actually, what's your reaction to it just off the cuff, first of all?
Well, Leigh, I think it's a beautiful work in every sense of the word. To listen to it was certainly a pleasure. I think that, as usual, the Modern Jazz Quartet played excellently on the thing. Quite astounding in places, because as you can tell by listening to this thing, it's a very intricate piece of work.
Seems almost mathematical in a way.
Well, actually, Leigh, all music is, in a way, mathematical. It has to be known that it is mathematical due to the fact that it is no longer possible, and hasn't been possible for quite a long time, as you probably know, to write an original melodic theme, such as Stardust or something like that. There's only a square root limitation of any set number of notes. For instance, if you have 3 notes in a song, you can only use those 3 notes 9 different ways, and so on down the line. Well, it gets a little farther along in that. However, in melodic music, you're restricted because a scale only employs 7 notes in melodic music, whereas in our atonal or our modern music, which the writing is employed here in this work by Gunther Schuller, the writing employed there involves the whole scale, which is half tones, which ends up a 12-tone scale.
What other elements of composition and technique did you note in this work?
Well, one thing that I was very impressed in the writing of this thing was that the writing was certainly written in a way that the musicians and the type of musicians that were employed in this playing were able to play, and play very well without getting in each other's way. And so to speak, a concert master was not asked to play a hot fiddle and so on down the line. His job was written, and he was employed to be exactly what he is and what he does very fine, and that is to play a legitimate violin, and so on down through the woodwinds and the other instruments in the orchestra. The Modern Jazz Quartet was allowed the freedom of maintaining their own pace, their own spirit as far as the ad-lib courses and the rhythm, the time most important, because Connie Kay was allowed to get with Percy Heath and keep this time going, whereas a lot of things that have been attempted in the past have been attempted primarily in making the mistake of trying to utilize the rhythm section, so to speak, of a symphony orchestra, such as their percussionists and their bassists, to play, or to try to play, and to try to get what we call a beat going, which it's totally alien to those people, even though our fine symphonies and the symphony players have definite rhythm. And that's the true test of a real fine orchestra and the conductor, is the fact that they have that rhythm, and they are able to hit right together. And that's where the difference between a very fine orchestra and a mediocre orchestra would be thought out number one, which certainly in this case the orchestra is not asked to do something that they can't do.
In other words, being actually hung with a ball and chain and ending up in a situation where the full orchestra is dragging its feet and the jazz group within it is tugging them along.
It would be the same thing reversed, to ask a jazz man to sit down and try to be a legitimate part of a legitimate orchestra. Actually,
what you're saying, John, is that Gunther Schuller has observed the limitations of the musicians involved, and the structure and the composition was so arranged that it took in the limitations of everyone involved and put them in the right framework.
That's right, exactly so, and I'm sure we can give examples of that right on down the line. For instance, we hope to hear some Basie maybe later on in the program, and you can always sort of line the thing up to where you might compare Basie trying to play a Stan Kenton arrangement.
And
the
percussionist trying to boot the Basie band along the line, and this
right.
percussionist might belong to the Minneapolis Symphony.
That's right.
Well, now, how can you judge a composition such as this concertino by Gunther Schuller? What makes this work artistically good? The things which you have just said?
Well, I don't feel that I'm a fine enough critic to make any comment on the composition itself. The only thing that I'm talking is the trying to answer the questions, and the questions were the way that it affected me. And I don't feel that I'm in any capacity whatsoever to in any way judge the composition on a pure composition merit. From the things that I remember doing, I did a work by Wojciech, the work by Alban Berg, the opera Wojciech, with the New York Philharmonic with Dmitri Mitropoulos, and I was tremendously moved by the composition itself, because it was so much and so well planned, and people sometimes get such wrong ideas about it, saying, well, this man just sat down and tried to write as many dissonances as he could write. And I had one very well-known musician who attended the concert, or one of the concerts, there were three. I had this very well-known musician make the remark. I had respected him before that. He made the remark to me that, well, all the guy did was write triads. You know, all different combinations of triads together, which is a very wrong analysis of a work. Having remembered and respected such work as that, I would not try to analyze this man's composition here.
You're modest, sir, and also, too, I respect what you say in not going ahead and evaluating this, and I put you on the spot. But actually, perhaps you could help the listeners and myself in this respect. Not judging the composition, but what elements of music, either historically or otherwise, are distilled in this concertina that we've just listened to?
Well,
what did you hear?
I heard a little bit of everything. I thought that at some points, especially in the beginning of the third movement, the last movement of this thing, that it starts off in a pretty down-to-earth sort of a blues feeling. Didn't you get that idea?
I had the feeling that it went right back to the roots of what might have been at one time work songs and spirituals.
Sure.
Just a shading and a nuance, introduced to give it, I suppose, a basically American kind of character.
That's right, and sometimes, Leigh, it's very hard to connect these two together. In other words, it's hard in a work for a person that listens to a work such as this to connect the Modern Jazz Quartet to the orchestra itself. But the third movement I thought was a very good movement to listen to form a connection between these two elements, because even though the orchestration in the third movement is quite modern and still employs the use of a certain element of 12-tone music or atonal music, it is definitely hinged in spots to where it connects perfectly to form. For instance, they're playing a G chord and the orchestra hits a C sharp, which or a D flat if you prefer. It makes that an augmented 11th or a flatted 5th, which I'm sure a lot of people, even the people only remotely interested in music, at this time have probably heard about flatted 5ths.
By this time, they probably only think of it in terms of a pair of bop glasses and a beret.
Yes, that's right. But however, it's just the word bop and the word progressive jazz only means one thing, and that is that we employ the use of advanced harmonies in our playing.
And certainly you felt that there were advanced harmonies here. Was there any of the tradition, such as the tradition of I suppose, the inspirer, the guide, and the leader of all classical music, someone like Johann Sebastian Bach? Was there anything that represented his thinking in this composition?
Well, all of our modern composers have certainly gone through Bach, or at least a good part of his employment of linear writing. And that includes Schoenberg, who we consider the father of all of our modern composers, which most all of the modern students of music respect him just as such. And most composers like Alban Berg, they have dedicated their works to Schoenberg because he was the man that was directly responsible for our transition from Wagner to the period of atonal music. His great work in the tonal music was, as you probably recall, Transfigured Night. And at that time, this man was condemned, or very badly panned by the critics, said that his work sounded just like Wagner, which in my opinion it doesn't at all. So they completely changed over then and went completely to 12-tone, which, as we know it today, is music that we don't understand, we don't hear. I don't profess to hear it at all, except certain parts of it begin to make a picture when you hear it over and over again. Just like driving an automobile, the first time you ever got in a car, you had complete frustrations about what to do with all the pedals at the same time and everything else. The same with music. You have to listen to it to begin to get a picture from music.
Briefly, John, once again, some of the elements of music distilled here, ranging from the traditional forms to contemporary. There's jazz in it, and good old down-home blues, and perhaps a bit of what is called today under the tag Soulsville, but just, gently sort of coursing through. There's the atonal aspect, and what else?
Well, you've just about got it there. The blues, a progressive form of writing, which, as I mentioned before, against the blues, he's gone into progressive additions within the orchestra itself, certain notes as we might know them as flatted fifths and things as such. Plus, he has the completely modern voicings of the whole orchestral range added on that. So that's about as far as I could go on it.
And, of course, the aspect and skill of the composer Gunther Schuller, guiding his musicians within their own elements and limitations to the point where there is a very sensible program.
Yes, well, it brings one thing to mind right there. You said a very interesting thing in the respects of Gunther Schuller conducting his own work. Of course, that's always a thrill and always an inspiration to have any man conduct his work, because he is so inspired and knows absolutely for sure within himself what he wants to hear. And one thing comes to mind that is very obvious on this recording, in the respects that everything flows along so freely, is this man definitely does not try to play an orchestra.
The orchestra does what?
The orchestra plays themselves. He doesn't try to play the orchestra.
Which is true artistic development.
Sure, it's true freedom, and that's the greatness inspired by a lot of our great conductors. They give the orchestra complete freedom. They don't beat every note right into the tops of their heads, which I think this is a very fine recording.
Johnny Smith, thanks ever so much for aiding us in presenting a preview of an exciting concert in American music. Composition, concertino, Gunther Schuller, conductor, arranger, and composer, featured along with the Modern Jazz Quartet and the Symphony Orchestra. And to you we say thanks, and to our listeners an invitation to make an excursion to Northrop Auditorium, the University of Minnesota, this coming Friday night for a performance of this work with the Modern Jazz Quartet in person, with the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra under its new leader, Skravachevsky. And incidentally, after the concert, why not journey to another world of music and join Johnny Smith at Herb's on Marquette between 3rd and 4th in Minneapolis. In a moment or two, we'll get back to Johnny Smith and talk a little bit more about classical music and musicians who are flexible and their limitations from infinity to, what, 10?
I don't know. You got yourself into that one. You get yourself out.
Meet you in a minute.